My name is Linda Hall. I'm one of the co-founders and president of Connected Community. We were founded in 2013 by 4 moms who wanted to build a better life for their own children with disabilities as well as others like them. Through our 4 areas of service, which are educational outreach, social and service opportunities, creative day services, and employment, we strive to help families prepare for and navigate the transition out of educational entitlements and into what we hope will be a full and meaningful life in the community. I want to take a minute to introduce our CTC board members that are here today. Co-founder and director Barb Tobias is in the back taking pictures. Co-founder and director Mary Hansen is here someplace. There she is over on the side. Director Sandy Ricketts is checking people in at the door. Director Judy Sinase, who's doing double duty here with the commission, and our employment specialist, Colleen Getz, who's also out at the registration table. We're always looking for new people to get involved with Connected Community, so if you're interested in being on our board or volunteering in another way, we'd love to have you. Just reach out and we'll put you to work, I guarantee it. I want to recognize our 2 partners in this event. First is the Village of Hoffman Estates and their Commission for People with Disabilities. The Village allows us to use this beautiful room, which we really appreciate, and the Commission generously provides our morning refreshments, tech support, videography, and more. So everybody who's here from the Commission or other volunteers from the Village, do you want to stand up and be recognized? I appreciate it. They're all hanging out over there somewhere. We put them to work, too. Our second event partner is NSSEO, the Northwest Suburban Special Education Organization. NSSEO has been a partner of Connected Community pretty much since day one, and we appreciate their support over the years. They print all of our seminar materials, and they handle the registration and administration of our continuing education credits for those professionals who are here today. So thank you so much, NSSEO. And finally, we want to publicly thank Palatine Township, who generously helps us with our educational outreach initiative, funding our events, which include free monthly Friday forums and informational tours, as well as this annual Transition Summit. Their support allows us to keep our costs low so we can keep our events as accessible to people as possible. A few notes about today's format. Because we have a really tight agenda, we ask you to please hold your questions to the end of each presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can while still keeping on our agenda format. In addition, in order to save time, behind your agenda in your event folders are the biographies for all of our speakers. Please take a look. Look at all the accomplishments that these people have. It's amazing. And it allows me to keep my introductions very short and succinct. So take a look at those when you have a chance. Okay, so let's get started. Today's event is about housing. And like so many things in the disability world, it's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. What's an ideal housing situation for my son may be a disaster for yours, and vice versa. So today we're going to start with an overview of kind of what different options are available in the state of Illinois, and then we're going to take kind of a deeper dive into some maybe more unique or things that you haven't really heard about before to give you some information that hopefully you can use. So while not every topic is going to apply to your family's situation, we hope that when you leave today, you'll have at least some information that will help you in making, more decisions and getting your journey started to find the right housing fit for you. Okay, that was a little too Lewis. Okay, we're going to kick off with our first speaker. Our keynote today is Todd Fuller. Todd has served as the statewide housing and employment first coordinator at the Illinois Department of Human Services since 2019. Working for nearly 20 years in the nonprofit sector in Illinois before joining state government, Todd developed his expertise in housing, employment, supportive services, and community planning through participation and leadership in a vast number of programs that are outlined further in his bio. We appreciate his willingness to share his time and expertise with our group this morning. Please welcome Todd Fuller.
Good morning, and thank you, Linda, for inviting me. Thank you all for having me here and showing up today to learn more about housing options in Illinois. It's always uncomfortable when somebody's introducing you and talking about your accolades and past. It always sounds like more than what I am. I'm just a guy. So feel free to approach me. Feel free to ask me questions. I'll try to stick around as long as I can today. I don't think I'll be able to stay for the whole event, but I will do my best to stay here as long as I can. And like Linda said, we're going to start at the 30,000 foot level, and then in some of our other presentations, we can work things down a little bit. I want to start a little bit with what we're doing at the Illinois Department of Human Services a little bit. This is our vision and our mission. I'm not going to read these. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of our housing principles and values that we have and that we're trying to more and more inject into all of our programs. And one thing that we understand is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to any problem. Anytime you have a one-size-fits-all approach, you're leaving somebody out, right? And so there's always a big spectrum, a big continuum of different services and different housing options for people who are in different situations and have different abilities and have different incomes. And there's never enough. There's never enough. I think that's one thing that you're going to want to take home and that you probably already know. But when it comes to the housing principles, these are the ones that we're really trying to focus on, especially this first one, the housing for, I was going to laser it, maybe not, a little too bright on the screen for the laser. That's okay. But this is when you acknowledge housing as a human right and you basically go into housing first. There's no acceptance of rules or compliance with service or anything else. Services are voluntarily engaged in, but we know that people need housing first, and we're trying to more and more raise that value up. Should be dignified, right? So least restrictive. Who has say over, or the most say over their day-to-day life and their choices and their activities and how they go about living their life on a day-to-day basis? That it's equitable, right? That there's not that discrimination in the housing and the support services. And like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's targeted to the populations that need the most help, and that it's inclusive, that we want to improve access to services, employment, opportunities for the social engagement, and being in and participating in community life. And that's not just, within a group home setting or just within your immediate neighborhood, but within your community, right? And community has many definitions, right? It could be peer groups, it could be the geographic area that you live in, it could be clubs and other social activities, but the sense of community is something that we know everybody needs. Decent, right? We need to have standards. They need to be safe. They need to be affordable. They need to be clean. It needs to be secure. The quality needs to be as high as we can make it. And that's something that we know needs a lot of help, especially for affordable programs and things that are government and state funded, right? You're always trying to get the most impact out of the funds spent, and it just never seems like there's enough funding available, right? Affordable, so when housing assistance is provided to help people afford the supportive housing when they don't have the money to pay the rent. Flexible, right? Like I said, everybody's different, and you have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to change and flex to people's needs, and they have personal goals. And if they don't, we should help them have personal goals, and they should be able to make choices throughout that process. And then effective, right? What's the intent? Is it really, to keep people stably housed, or is it to move them into a more independent setting as you go along? That's something to think about, and using those evidence-based practices, right? Wherever possible, and make sure we change those. Make sure we change our policies, procedures. So we need to hear a lot, and sometimes, especially at government, things can be slow to change, and that's for a good reason. Moving right into it. So housing is an interesting word, right? You might sometimes see different definitions or hear people talk about housing in different terms. Does this count nursing care facilities? Does this count emergency homeless shelters? Does this count group homes, right? Like what type of things fall into that? Or is it more housing like the development world thinks about it, where, you know, they want to build an affordable housing development. They got to go get tax credits and permission from the local zoning board or whoever to go and build this stuff. And it's, you know, more rent-based as opposed to some of the residential settings that maybe you might hear room and board. Sometimes that's a term that's thrown around, where the services and whatever setting this is, or whatever residential form it takes, be it an apartment or a CILA, a group home, whatever you want to call it. A lot of different language is used, but where it's, you know, kind of supervised, it's managed or run by somebody else. It's not somebody's own place where they have their own, you know, landlord-tenant rights or their own home ownership. Housing tends to get narrowed down a little bit, but there's a lot of options out there. So you see a lot of these. Maybe some of these terms you've heard before. Hopefully you've seen them. The intermittent family CILA, where you run this out of a family home or a private home, somebody's own individual apartment. This can work for that. The community integrated living arrangements, which are the CILAs, the community living facilities, and we're going to go through all these a little bit more. Supportive living facilities, really designed for people with some of those physical and mobility needs. The children's group homes, the child care institutions, the ICFDDs, right, the intermediate care facilities for people with developmental disabilities, and then you have our state-operated developmental centers. One less now, I hear. But really the goal that everybody should be moving towards is what's the least restrictive, right? Where people have the most say over their day-to-day life, the most community integrated, the most appropriate, meaning they're getting the level of services on a day-to-day basis that they need to be as stable and independent as they can be, that it's voluntary, that people have their own choice, right? You have that own individual consideration that you need to take into account. Like I said, be very, very person-centered. And think about this, you know, do people want to live independently? Do they want to live with a roommate? Do they want to live in a community of folks who have similar disabilities to what they have? But what you see here is kind of, and it's not perfect. There might be a couple in the middle out of order here, and it might vary a little bit, you know, from CILA to CILA, or supportive living programs to supportive living program. But really you have the lower service need options towards the top and the higher service needs at the bottom. And what undoubtedly comes along with that is those are the least restrictive options, where people have the most choice over day-to-day life activities. And when I say day-to-day life activities, I'm talking about when do you eat, when do you go to bed, when is there social time, you know, when, you know, are you venturing out? I mean, can you go to work? You know, what is it that your day-to-day life, you want it to look like, and what does it look like? But again, you're going to go from least restrictive to most restrictive based on these settings. And the same is true with the integration, right? You're going to be more integrated into the general public community and least integrated towards those options at the bottom. So SODCs, like I said, these are our state-operated developmental centers. The state does run these facilities. It's long-term care, right, like a skilled nursing facility or some other options. In order for admission in these, you get a careful screening with the ISCs. That they're sort of the gatekeepers, and it's really intended for people who have severe medical and or behavioral needs, right? And it's that one center that provides the mental health and all of the other wraparound services. We operate 7 facilities, like I said, 1 closing. Don't know if you heard about that down south. Probably won't affect most people in our area, but way down in southern Illinois, the Choate facility is going to be closing if it hasn't already. But you can find these links. I believe they're going to send this out electronically after today's meeting, but you shouldn't have to write all these down. Hopefully you can just click these links from the PDFs that will go out later. But this is where you can find information about the SODCs, and there's a list of all those facilities. So the intermediate care facilities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, I got used to calling it ICFDD, and now they've changed the letters now to ICFIID. That's fine. They're always changing their wonderful alphabet soup around. I can't keep up with everything. All the acronyms I deal with on a daily basis would blow your mind. But they do change them from time to time, so I'm trying to keep up. Again, this is another long-term care facility. This is considered long-term care, but it's that training, treatment, health services, but it's really directed towards folks acquiring, the skills and the behaviors necessary for them to function with as much self-determination and independence as possible. That means it's not intended to be forever, right? We go back to that spectrum of options for people, and we should constantly be rethinking this. Maybe the level of independence was appropriate at one time. Maybe now somebody's ready for more independence, right? People grow, people develop, and people change over time. That's everybody, and I think probably this room knows that as well as anybody. And again, the list of those facilities and more information you can find at this link here. So supportive living programs. This is the first one that we're pulling up that is not specific to persons with developmental disabilities, right? But we do see folks who have some physical and mobility needs, who have developmental disabilities, finding these programs maybe the most appropriate places for them to reside, whether temporary or even on a more permanent basis. So HFS, there's one of those acronyms I was talking about. Oops, I better stay with the microphone. There's one of the, I like to move around, so this is hard to just stay here in this box. So I'll try to move with my arms and stuff like that so you guys don't get bored and unenergetic. But that's healthcare and family services, right? That's one of our sister state agencies, and they're the Medicaid entity for the state of Illinois. So a lot of, when you go to apply for Medicaid and SNAP benefits or food stamps, if somebody's still using that language, but you get like the cards now, and it's called SNAP and LINK and all that. More acronyms, of course. But HFS kind of governs and works with the federal government on how to apply the Medicaid funding. So when you apply, you're applying usually at an IDHS office. We're sort of the gatekeepers, and we take in all those applications because we have so many locations around the state, which, by the way, we have like 15,000 employees at IDHS. So if you ask me if I know somebody or about some of our programs, I might have never heard of them before, just a heads up. But the HFS waiver that they put for supportive living programs, it allows payment for services that you wouldn't normally get covered by Medicaid, so they can make these work. And some things they don't pay for, right? But again, they don't do everything. So if folks have a level of care above this, it's not to say that it might not be the right setting for them to help with their physical and mobility issues, but they might have to have some external help because the facilities, won't be able to pay for some of the services that are above and beyond what's kind of listed here. And again, the resident's responsible for paying the cost of the room and board at these facilities. So a lot of times it can be really, really tight for folks with their income. And then the services provided on site, again, they're not designed to be IDD specific, but it could meet the needs of an individual just based on, again, their own personal circumstances. Like I said, everybody's situation is different. There's just over 150 Illinois, but only 11 of them statewide are going to be open to persons 22 to 64 with physical disabilities. So a lot of these are geared towards, our senior population. So you can see that very clearly. Again, did I put? Oh, I know. I had another slide. Here's how you can locate a supportive living program on HFS's website through this link right here. And again, don't write that whole thing out. You should be able to get an electronic copy after the fact that you can just click and go as necessary. So the community living facilities now, that's another one of those options on the spectrum that I had on the slide earlier. Again, this is another transitional residential setting. And again, transitional just means it's really not intended to be forever, if you see that word. And that means a lot in a lot of different places, right? There's transitional housing for a lot of different populations. And I want to maybe bring that out right now in saying, you know, ask questions, because when people say transitional housing, it could be for a lot of different types of specific populations. Is it for homeless persons who have been living on the street? Is it for you know, people who are exiting the Department of Corrections and need some temporary time to get back on their feet and get a job so they can get their own residence? Is this for people who are being diverted away from entering a mental health facility so that they could find the mental health services and support they need to continue living into the community and not have to go into a specialized mental health rehabilitation facility, which is maybe my favorite acronym because they always say SMURF when they sound that out, which I think is pretty cool. And then skilled nursing facilities, they call SNFs, right? SNFs. So we got a lot of Smurfs and sniffs, and that's the language. And in some of these meetings, I just want to laugh, but they are kind of funny. But they're no longer institutions of mental disease, right? And some of those older language. We keep changing with time, right? But again, there's so many different subpopulations where the programs and the housing and the services that go along with them need to be tailored to folks with their individual needs, because they're not necessarily, you know, somebody with a substance use disorder and may or may not have, you know, mental health issues as well, and may or may not have physical, right? So everybody really needs different types of services, and that's why things get so big, things get so confusing, and when you hear about housing, is this an option that works for us or doesn't work for us? You kind of got to dig in and get more information, because you can sometimes follow a lead and then have to turn around and go back and realize, hey, this isn't right for who we're trying to find housing for. Again, you got to have a waiver for these services, and one important thing to keep in mind is, you know, waivers change. You know, folks are getting Medicaid and they have a waiver and they're at a CILA, and maybe folks are now ready to move on. Maybe they don't need as many hours of care, so they could move into, you know, maybe their own private unit or back into a family home and only have services, you know, for a lesser amount of time because they no longer need the 24/7 care. They're going to end up, you know, switching that waiver around, and that can take some time. So you really have to work with your ICF if you're going to be moving from an ICF IID or an SODC. You're going to be moving through those, or a supportive living program, because that's a different waiver. And believe me, I'm not an expert on Medicaid waivers, but basically what they do is they put in for these exceptions for special populations. And they get approval from the federal government to reserve some of the state's Medicaid funding then to apply to these specific programs that, again, like I said on the last slide, for the supportive living programs, that meet the needs of the individuals they're trying to serve. So we have, you know, the Division of Mental Health has one waiver, DDD has some adult waivers, and you have different categories of stuff that falls under that. You got the children's waivers under there. So there's a lot of different ways of doing that. They're now, you know, amending and adding a waiver, trying not to use too much technical language, but they call it an 1115 waiver. They throw around so many numbers and acronyms, it's hard to keep up with. But they're putting in one now where folks can bill Medicaid straight for housing supports in ways that they haven't been able to do that anymore. That's just sort of a preview. That's certainly not something that's public or for sure. You know, they've got to submit it to the federal government, but it's going to open up some new opportunities, hopefully in the future. Again, this is not long-term care. It's not a nursing or a medical facility, but the services are specific for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You know, by regulation, they can't have more than 20 residents, and there's only 9 operating in Illinois. And you could take a look at this link here for more information and the locations. CILAs, or ICILA. This is the one I think people are probably most familiar with, and the CILA word gets thrown around a lot. You hear it a lot. But again, it's a community integrated living arrangement. But Todd, we saw on there that maybe those were a little more restrictive and less integrated than some of the other options. Yeah, well, it's not completely integrated, but they are in the community. And right now, it's a max of 8 residents, and I think the preference for that really is about 4, maybe 6. But the fewer residents you have, the more comfortable it's going to be, and the more services are going to benefit the individuals. And you don't want to they're hard to build too. There's a lot of pushback. Sometimes when you hear about affordable housing or group homes getting built, they've got to go and get a special use permit from the village or city or county, wherever they're located. And then all of a sudden you get some of the villagers coming out with torches and pitchforks and, the whole NIMBY, not in my backyard stuff. One time with Cornerstone Services, if any of you are familiar with Cornerstone Services over in Joliet, which I'm kind of generally from that area over there, Joliet and Plainfield. I went to a public hearing, and it was one of the worst things that I've ever experienced and one of the best things that I've ever experienced, because they were putting in what they wanted to build was a CILA in a neighborhood in Joliet, and I don't know why, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why, but the other people in the neighborhood came out and they're like, oh, this is going to increase traffic. Our children aren't going to be safe. They're going to put people with deviant sexual behaviors and things like that in that housing, and just some of the most god-awful things I've heard. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Just because you heard one news story one time where, somebody might have got hurt at a group home, now all of a sudden you want to assume that's the case, everywhere, and it's just not. But the best part of this is after everybody got done talking was Cornerstone's turn, and it was the funniest thing. They said, well, we've already got one of these residences in the neighborhood, and we haven't had any complaints, and neither has the city. So it was almost like that mic drop moment where it's like, yes, thank you for putting everybody's perspective in place. Again, so these are scheduled and unscheduled supports. This is IDD-specific services. So for the CILA and things like that, you got to work with a provider who has the capacity to provide those services and go to people's homes. I know that's a tough barrier, and believe me, right now across all of our service systems, staffing is a challenge. We keep trying to increase rates. We keep trying to make the pay better for the folks who are providing these services and working in these environments. But that's difficult, and we're always running short. Just doing a time check. So I just want to be mindful in saying, there's only so many of these. Sometimes they're difficult to put up in the places where they're needed for the reasons I've stated and many other reasons. It's hard to make some projects financially viable. A lot of nonprofits are running these organizations, so for nonprofits to grow, they've got to know that funding and resources and grants and donations and everything else are going to be in place to support that growth in their capacity. So there can be a lot of barriers and challenges to getting these things going and making sure that they're located everywhere that they're needed. And like I said, there's many more individuals seeking this setting than there are openings to accommodate them. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and get into supportive housing. Those were sort of, like I said, the Division of Developmental Disabilities specific programs that are supported other than the supportive living programs, which are through HFS. But we're going to start to think about things a little bit differently. So supportive housing, there's a more general definition here where it's units for people with very low incomes, right? It's meant to be affordable when we talk about supportive housing. And disabilities, which is just multiple barriers to community living, not necessarily DD specific, right? And then they get the social and health services that they need to succeed in the community. But it's affordable, it's permanent, it's independent. So a lot of times that means they have their own lease and their own landlord-tenant rights that go along with that, which is a good thing, and helps people who face the most complex challenges. And again, these words that I love: stability, autonomy, and dignity. And it's not intended for every population that needs affordable housing, right? Supportive housing isn't affordable housing in general. We'll cover that in a little bit. But they need services, right? That threshold's higher. They need housing and they need those support services so that they can live independently. And sometimes it looks different, right? They have this single site project based. Oh, the laser is working a little bit. Okay. Where, this building is dedicated to housing folks with these particular needs. Or you have clustered, maybe it's not the whole building, but it's a wing or a floor or a section, or maybe the organization providing the services is renting out part of a building or a complex or one building out of multiple buildings. The most desired and most integrated, keep throwing that word around, is where you have scattered site, where either there's apartments that are scattered throughout buildings and complexes at different properties used for this purpose, or people choose their own, and then the services are brought to them wherever they're at. And that's really a model that more and more you'll see government trying to focus on. And then you have this integrated affordable too, where maybe you have an affordable housing development and maybe they have some private market units in there as well. And by private market, I mean, not lower rent or not affordable or not subsidized or anything like that. And that's really ideal if you have people with different income ranges living in the same places. That's integration. Our doctors and lawyers have to get their coffee in the morning for people who work at Starbucks, and they should all be able to live in similar communities. And I know not everybody can afford different houses in some of the nicer neighborhoods and things like that, but the closer we can all be together and the more integrated we can be, studies show that that's just better for society and social structures all around. And that includes people with disabilities, that includes race, national origin, all of those things. Where there's more diversity and inclusion and acceptance, there's just a better standard of life across the board. So again, with supportive housing, it might not automatically come with the services, right? There's some options where you can, if you have the services and you're getting the services, you might be able to find some housing options that you can take those services with you. But it works both ways, right? Housing doesn't necessarily come with services. Services don't necessarily come with housing. And that coordination can sometimes be a real pain, right? It could be a challenge because it's like, well, hey, we got the lease signed. Oh, well, we can't get your service waiver going for another 30 days. It's going to take a little bit of time. So maybe there's a delay in moving in. And in the meantime, or it could be the other way around. Maybe you've got the services ready to go, but maybe the housing's not available, or you're struggling to find a unit that'll meet an individual's needs. And I'll tell you that there's never enough accessible housing for people with disabilities also. And again, sometimes supportive housing pairs nicely with intermittent CILA services because you could find your own unit and then you could get those services lined up through a service provider to come into somebody's home. So again, maybe not you, but maybe your ISC or your service provider is arranging for the social health services. Maybe somebody's still on the PUNS list. They haven't yet got to that. Maybe they're using the home services program through our division of rehab services. There could be a lot of sources of services, really. And so then, well, how do we provide the housing to go along with that? That's really what supportive housing can be. And again, sometimes supportive housing is packaged with the services and the housing, but not necessarily. And now we'll get into some of these housing types. This is always the fun one because everybody has opinions and knowledge, whether right or wrong, about some of these programs. So on one hand, you have some subsidized housing resources. And does anybody know what I mean by subsidized? Who could give me a good definition? Let's try.
It's year to year. I mean, the rent would be based solely on you. It's individualized.
Right, yeah, so the rent is based on the individual's income. And so what you generally see is affordable, and you see this percentage thrown around all over the place, is 30%, right? 30% of somebody's income is ideally the most they should be paying for their rent plus utilities. A lot of people don't realize that fair market rents, if you hear that out there too, through HUD, that includes the utilities as well. Sometimes that makes it pretty tight. But the sources of subsidized housing, and again, based on individual income, their rent is gonna be 30% of their income. The vast majority of these options are available through public housing authorities, right? They have the Section 8 program at the PHAs, another acronym, Public Housing Authorities. They have the Section 8 program, which is what you hear people say, Section 8 voucher. Well, that's a housing choice voucher. That's what they call it now, but you'll still hear the Section 8 voucher language thrown around. And it doesn't always make a lot of sense because there's also these project-based vouchers. So when you say Section 8 voucher, it could really mean both of these. But this one means it's tenant-based, meaning you get to choose a unit as long as it's under the affordability range and as long as it can pass inspection, it's up to quality standards. Then you can use your housing choice voucher there. If it's a project-based rental assistance, that's tied to the unit. So whoever lives in that unit gets that voucher. The housing choice voucher, they could take with them if they move into a new place. The project-based voucher, if somebody moves out, the next person that moves into that unit gets it, right? Then you have Section 202, supportive housing for the elderly. And actually, you have a lot of DD housing that falls under this because, they get waivers and exceptions from HUD to also serve people with disabilities. So if you hear Section 202 thrown around, or you hear about a provider, that operates facilities or campuses, and they've got HUD subsidies for the units or anything like that, they probably applied to HUD to develop the property and get development funds, and then have some of those ongoing subsidies to make that option affordable for folks. So you'll see a lot of that. There's quite a bit of that actually, and if I'm going to give you a link to find those resources, and you'll be able to see and maybe recognize some of those. Then we have Section 811, supportive housing for persons with disabilities. This one is actually the Illinois Housing Development Authority gets Section 8 funding from HUD. They were just awarded a new round in 2019. They've been continuously building and opening new units from funds from like 2012 and 2013, even all the way up until now, because development takes time, right? But this, if you hear about PAIR or the statewide referral network or any of that stuff thrown around, that actually falls under my direction. And all of these units are accessible through an application. You have to work with an ISC, maybe a housing navigator that you'll hear about later on, or a service provider to add somebody to the list for these units. There's not a lot of them. There's right around 300 of them statewide. But again, this is IDA paying their subsidy. They only have to pay 30% of what their own individual household income is. If they're just one person, then it's just the individual income. And what's great about some of these project-based rental assistance, the 202 and the Section 811, is that these have extended use agreements. EUAs. I know somebody just threw that acronym at me the other day. But what that means is they have to keep that unit affordable, and they have to keep using that unit for those purposes for an extended period of time as a condition of getting the funding to create that unit, right? So sometimes that's a good protection, and we've got a circumstance right now where a building got a new owner, and the new owners are coming in and reviewing everything, and they may or may not want to continue some of their business and residential relationships and leases with some of the folks living there. And right now we're trying to get in between and mitigate that and try to negotiate a little bit to keep folks there. But sometimes that can happen. And so when you're using like a housing choice voucher, or you're in an own independent setting, sometimes that can be a potential risk in the future. So we almost need some of these project-based settings and these places where the money is tied physically to a single location to help keep overall rent prices down, right? Because if everything's just private market, what we saw from COVID is rent went way up, right? Housing prices went way up. You see a lot of landlords being a little bit more restrictive and picky in their tenant selection processes, and you see it being a lot more competitive and increasing, rent application fees. And now we're seeing a lot of these, instead of just security deposits, these non-refundable deposits or administrative fees that we see folks talking about. So when the rental market tightens up, that can make things really, really challenging. And then you have just affordable housing down here, right? And that's where you'll see properties that just have like low-income housing tax credits, and they usually have a pretty mixed bag of financing sources, all of which have their own regulations and requirements and all that type of stuff. So it can make it challenging to run these and challenging to access these sometimes. But they do have lower rents as a result, and they do still have those extended use agreements to make sure that we preserve and keep affordable housing in place. Rent determination. I know I talked about this a little bit, but this is something you want to drive home. Market rate, that's just set at what people will pay, right? Whatever people will pay, that's what they're happy to charge. Excuse me. Income-based housing is really set for a range of affordability, right? So a lot of times what you'll see is, well, this one's set to people who can afford it, who are making about 30% of the area median income. There's another 30%, but it's a different 30%. Or 60% of the area median income. You'll see 30, 50, 60, and 80. That's a lot of them that are thrown around quite a bit. But again, the rents are set at what people who are in those income ranges should be able to afford. And it's not subsidized based on their own individual income. It's usually a set rent. So I see those in the $300, $400, up to the $700 and $800 range sometime, just depending on where you're looking, because the affordability, the area median income, the fair market rent, all that changes depending on where you move around geographically, as opposed to the subsidized housing, again, that we talked about, where it's really based on the own individual's income. Is this all repeat? Does anybody learn? Let me see a hand if you learned something new. Oh, thank God. Some of the crowds I talk to roll their eyes like, yeah, we know this stuff, Todd. But not everybody does. And I want to make sure I'm meeting you guys where you're at, and certainly not where I'm at. You don't want to have this running around in your head all day, every day. It'll turn your hairs white, as I was telling somebody else. Getting a lot more of those. Moving on. So the HUD resource locator. This is a good one because all the investments that the federal government is going to make into developing and providing ongoing support to housing, you're going to be able to find it through this source, right? And you might find some overlap from some other sources too, because like I said, affordable housing, so much harder to develop than luxury housing, right? Luxury housing, you're probably going to have one lender because you're going to be able to show how nice this is and how much people want to live here and how much rent you're going to get, right? Versus the affordable housing where you got to get grants and tax credits and all kinds of special use permits and all. You really got to go through a lot. And so at the closing and when they're financing these projects, it's like a portfolio of stuff happening, right? And it's not easy. So you'll see some of these that HUD invests in. There might be state investments as well, right? There might be tax credits through the state or other programs through the state to help support these. So, but you can find all those. The ones I mentioned earlier, the Section 202 HUD programs, all that stuff, you're going to be able to find through the HUD resource locator. And it'll even pull up a map and show all the locations around your area you're looking in where HUD has dollars invested. They follow the money on this one, so that's a good way to track it down. And I've got these specifically circled, right? Find affordable housing opportunities near me and find affordable elderly and special needs housing. But again, good resource for tracking down where the federal money is being invested. So if you need to contact a public housing authority, you're not sure how to do that, this is, there is a way to do it. They might have fixed this, Find My Local Public Housing Agency, but that link didn't work very well from my experience. So I put another one in here where you can select the state and try to find more. There's 110 public housing authorities in Illinois. There's only 102 counties, right? That tells you there's more housing authorities than counties. In some places, you'll have a municipality that's covered by a housing authority, and that's just within their city limits. And then maybe the county housing authority covers the rest of the county that's unincorporated or the other municipalities that don't have their own. So it's really a good idea to look and see where the individual housing authorities in the areas that you're interested in looking in are. And I'll tell you, they close their wait lists for housing choice vouchers, for project-based vouchers. They could be closed for years. And then when they open them and people get on the wait list, people could wait on those wait lists for years. Like I said, there's never enough, and it's extremely frustrating. So when you have an opportunity, whether it's timely or not, I would get somebody on there if they're in need of affordable and subsidized housing. I would, you can, if they do Facebook, if they do anything at that public housing authority, I do it. And that's the other stressful part is they all have their own application and processes and procedures. They all have their own individual public housing plan that they submit to HUD, FYI. They don't report up to any state agency. They go directly to HUD. So we don't necessarily have a say on their plans or how they use their stuff outside of something that may get legislated. Like there is a Public Housing Act in Illinois, but it doesn't start saying, hey, you need to prioritize these populations for housing, or you need to do this or that. It just sets some other types of regulations in place. That sounded negative about public housing authorities. I don't intend it to be negative, but it is what it is. So eligibility criteria, in general, you got to be low income or very low income, right? And low income is 80% of the area median income. Very low income is 50% of the area median income. And then extremely low income is 30% of the area median income. So if you see those terms being thrown a lot, that's really what they're talking about. And income limits are tight. $1 over, you're not going to qualify, right? Those are the one things that there's not a lot of flexibility on, are the income limits. So for housing choice vouchers, again, in general, they cannot exceed 50% of the area median income, with resources targeted to households who are at 30% area median income and below. Now I've thrown out, what I didn't include was a link to figure out what your local area median income is, but there's a website called huduser.org. That's where you're going to be able to find things like fair market rents and area median incomes and all those types of income limits and other things that are going to apply to a lot of the housing that you find out there. And again, with the federal funding, we don't have a lot of restrictions when it comes to state funding unless it's a federal pass-through about whether or not somebody's a citizen or a non-citizen. But in a lot of the federal government funded programs, because of statute, you'll find a lot of the permanent options and the affordable housing options, not things like temporary shelter stays or transitional housing. A lot of times they won't have those restrictions, but you will see some of the ongoing subsidies and permanent resources for housing get limited to folks who have a qualifying immigration status. And HUD's got on their website all kinds of rules and regs about that. If you want to do reading and you want to become an expert, you could just Google HUD handbooks, and you go find those handbooks, and you'll see all kinds of stuff in there, and it's impossible to regulate or to navigate and understand all of those all the time. I tell you that because sometimes the properties and the public housing authorities don't even know all of those to a T. So if you get no for an answer and it doesn't sound right, reach out to an expert who might be able to help you navigate those situations and who does know a little bit more. I know more than I ever wanted to about HUD regulations, trust me. Whew. And learning how to navigate those, it's awful. ilhousingsearch.org. So we just saw the resource where you can find where the federal government invests in its housing resources. This is the resource where you're going to find the state investments in housing resources. So the Illinois Housing Development Authority has created this ilhousingsearch.org. It's open to the public. You can create an account. You can save searches for your area or your specific accessibility needs, whatever it is. They require, anybody who's funded through IDA is required to list their units on here. And I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of units on here, believe it or not. And you might see some crossover again, because sometimes the federal government and the state government is investing in housing resources. So they're duplicated. You're going to find duplicates between both of these resources. Statewide referral network. Raise your hand if you've heard of this. Okay, that's okay. We're trying to do better about that. But this, in general, it's a partnership of these 4 state agencies, right? HFS that I talked about earlier, Healthcare and Family Services, Department on Aging, us at IDHS, and IDA, the Illinois Housing Development Authority. But we want basically to give service providers first crack at some of the affordable housing resources that are available in Illinois. So what happens is, there's a lot, I'm not going to read through all this type of stuff, but basically, and this does fall under my direction, we're engaging in strategic planning right now to improve some of these processes, and some of our headaches could be on the property side of things as well, but believe me, these are improving. We're housing a lot more people right now than we ever did in the past. We're tightening up. So far in 2023, we're averaging a household a day that we're moving into SRN units. So it is a resource that's growing. It's a resource that's becoming more accessible and easier to access. We're trying to clean that up as much as possible, but it's not an easy task. It's really not an easy task. I could go into the reasons why. If anybody's interested in connecting with me and finding out more about that, please do. We do trainings that are just on this as well. But basically, when IDA says, hey, we're going to give you money to build and develop and make money off of these affordable housing developments, we're going to request that you set aside 5 to 10% of your units to give our service providers working with HFS and IDHS and aging an opportunity to refer folks before you just take folks off your own wait list, right? Because most of these properties, if they're filled up and they're high in demand, they might have their own wait list. But we say we want to bypass that. We're tired of Public Housing Authority wait lists. We're tired of all these wait lists of affordable housing. And we have people who are paired with maybe Medicaid waiver services or other service programs that we fund. We want to give the caseworkers who are helping those folks find housing maybe sort of a first crack at getting in the door. And so it's not all of those units. The rest of those units are on ilhousingsearch.org, right? So if 5 to 10% are set aside for the statewide referral network, that other 90 to 95% you're still going to want to find on ilhousingsearch.org. And one big takeaway is never put all your eggs in one basket with housing, right? There's a lot of different options out there, and some might come available before others come available. And it's not easy to navigate, again, because, PHAs report directly to HUD. They get their funding directly from HUD. State doesn't have a lot of say in it. State tries to fill in maybe some of the gaps in what that is. But again, everybody has sort of their own regs and process and policies and procedures. I would love if there was one application to rule them all and you went to one website, put in your data, and you apply to every PHA and everything that you qualify for. We're a ways off from that, unfortunately. That's gonna take a lot of work. That's what I would love to get to someday. That's my hopes and dreams. I don't know if it's realistic or not because think about all of the bureaucracies, plural, that fall under doing that, and a lot of funding at stake and a lot of politics at stake. So I don't know if we'll ever really get there. So for now, casting a wider net is better and really understanding all of those housing options and working with people who have experience navigating all these different housing options is really a good idea. Almost done. I don't even know how many more slides I have. If I don't get through them, I'm good at putting more information to these slides than I'm going to get through, but luckily you guys are getting copies of all this. But that pair, like I was telling you about, it's just pre-screening, assessment, intake, and referral. Only case managers can access this. So if you have a service provider, you're working with a housing navigator, an ISC, whatever it is, they may or may not have access to this. Tell them about it. Tell them to call me. I'm seeing a lot of wonderful expressions. Do you have a comment or a question? Feel free to share.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing. Nobody has an answer. Everybody, they can't keep staff doing it. They should.
There's a lot of that going around.
They should let parents know.
There's a lot of that going around, unfortunately. Hey, parents are the best service providers there are possible. You can't replace parents. But again, they have the option of utilizing this as a resource if, in their jobs and in their service provision, they're able to help search for housing. And again, that's why we have the new pilot program that Miranda is going to talk about later, right? So let's keep going. Again, only available to service providers. So the SRN and Section 811 units that go through this, these are outdated. There's actually maybe a little bit more now. Again, 30% of the area median income is going to be the limit on these. So you'll want to check out huduser.org. There I repeated it since I didn't include it to find things like area median income. And also the caseworker, if they're inputting potential applications into our system, it will calculate their income eligibility automatically. And again, those Section 811 units, same thing, ongoing HUD subsidy, but it's paid by IDA, not through your local housing authority. And this is where they're located. They really are statewide. Not every county has units in it. 60 out of 102, only about 59% of the counties. But you can see they're spread around pretty good. There's not complete coverage. The 811, little less so, right? There's not as many of those floating around because there's only 300 total. And you'll see, a lot of the majority of stuff is in and around Chicago, Cook County, and the Collier counties here. Where we're at. I'm going to let you read this. I'm not going to spend the time going through all these slides, and because I really do want to open it up for some questions and some back and forth. What do we have, 5 minutes?
Okay, I'm curious if you could talk about how intermittent CILAs work, because I'm thinking this is maybe the way to practice self-determination in the state, because you can stay out of day programs if you would like to do that, because they do not work for my son. And I just wanted to know if you could tell me more about that, and can you add, and I also want to know, because my son would require staff that we train pretty heavily, so I need to retain them. So I wonder if there's a way I can legally add money to what they're getting from the state so that I can retain my staff in that program. And would this work for 24-hour care? I think it would if you apply for the funding. I want to know more about intermittent CILAs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'll tell you, and look, I do not work for the Division of Developmental Disabilities, so I'm not going to be able to get into detailed answers about how that works, unfortunately. I wish I knew all that, but I work with, we got 7 divisions at IDHS now. We used to only have 5, right? And so some of those particular, operational regulations and things like that, or whether you can add money and does that affect your eligibility or anything like that, those are really specific questions that I'm not going to be able to answer, but I could tell you this. People used to think that ICILA was limited to 15 hours, which you can throw that out. You can work with your ISC to determine an appropriate level of need and what the hours are, and you could submit for increases in that. It's not a hard cap at 15 hours, so you can go up. I don't know if you can go all the way to 24/7. That's really going to have to question. Because, again, I told you I'm not an expert on the Medicaid waivers and all that type of stuff, so I'm sorry. I would really have to defer you to the ISC or division staff.
I guess the problem is that in this state, the only way, there's not many options for somebody. There's not many options for somebody who needs care 24 hours, but doesn't really, but wants to have some self-determination. So I'm trying to figure out, even if I were to purchase his own condo or whatever, I'm trying to figure out how to keep him out of an ICF. I don't want him in one of those because it's not a good match for him. And so I don't get it. And it's so hard, and I've read so much. And I'm very, 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 very frustrated by how to make that work, because I think with CILAs, the problem is during the daytime you lose all your funding unless you're in an accredited day program, is essentially how I'm reading it, right?
Well, sorry, somebody have an answer that knows this specifically? I don't know about the day program requirements per se. That's something I'm not 100% sure on. Let's get some outside expertise.
Not an expert, not at all. I'm gonna, just for that answer, is just that I was speaking with an agency because I don't think my son would be able to tolerate a day program, and they said that there are people in their agency that only stay in the home during the day, while some are independent enough to go to work with a job coach, and some stay. That's an agency that's just coming into the state. It's,
Yeah.
oh.
And
Vista.
the day program, I'm not sure that that's still the case, if it ever was, because I'm not aware of that requirement, but that doesn't mean it's not there somehow. I can tell you that provider capacity, even if the option's there to do ICILA, and even if it would be a good fit for somebody, sometimes finding a service provider that has the staff and ability to work wherever you're going to be located at might be challenged.
This is why housing needs to be integrated with all this, because all your housing options won't work if you don't have a day component. So they all have to be integrated, or why bother even doing it? Does that make sense? I don't mean, I'm not trying to be critical.
You're right.
But that's truly what the problem is.
These are the battles that we're facing and trying to figure out how to make better.
And it's not a problem.
Yeah.
Wisconsin doesn't have this problem. Illinois does.
I know. Wisconsin has other problems. And I'll tell you, careful about comparing your states, because some things may seem better everywhere else than Illinois, but other things may be a whole lot better in Illinois than ours. And that's why it's really hard. It's never apples to oranges. When, or maybe it is apples to oranges, sorry. Am I speaking on a turn? I don't know. It's Saturday morning. I should be watching cartoons with my little man. And we look at what other states are doing too as a case, and they're saying, well, yeah, but then we got to pull funding from this that state doesn't have, and there's a lot of back and forth, and it's confusing and it's tiring, and we hear you. We hear you. We absolutely hear you. And again, like I said, no one size fits all. We want more options, and we want to be able to work better with public housing authorities. We want to work better with properties who have affordable housing developments, and saying, hey, you got to be more open to our people who need high levels of services. We even get a lot of non-discriminatory discrimination, right? Like, we get people denied coming out of a nursing care facility due to their credit, and it's like, no kidding. They've been in a nursing care facility for 5 years and getting to keep $30 a month of their income. What kind of credit do you expect them to have, right? There's a lot of very frustrating barriers out there. But know that there are people trying to work on reducing those barriers, trying to make the cases that you're making right now. We hear that and we're with you. We're
Okay.
with you.
So I want to piggyback on this parent's comment and your comment about parents being the best support providers. So last year at this time, I was speaking with Allison Stark about this idea to try to relieve some of the DSP shortage problems. One of the biggest barriers is you can be a PSW for your kid when they're at home on the home-based waiver, yet when they switch to the CILA funding, now you can't be. Okay, that is ridiculous. If you allowed parents to even relieve staff 2 days a week, you're going to help with the staff shortage, right? So that is one barrier that would help relieve some of the shortages where it won't be policy. It'll be a policy change, not legislation, but I don't know who to go forward with that. And the other change that needs to happen is DSP training should be from you guys, from Springfield, not have to get a job at all these various agencies to be trained as a DSP. And then it's not standardized then. You're not going to get the same level of care or training as you would if it was just even a Zoom class with, DSP training. And I know there's been some initiatives with school kids and the Illinois State Board of Education coming into it. That's still 2 years out. So that's a great idea too, but a really immediate solution would be to allow parents to become DSPs and to have a standardized training. And if there's someone you could tell me who to move forward with that, or you have names or contacts for me, I could, help with that as much as possible because, we have a person that needs a real high level of support that.
Yeah, let's talk after.
Okay.
We could talk after.
Okay, there was someone who had a question over here. Trying to get everyone.
And again, remember, folks, unfortunately, I'm not the services across the board expert. I'm the housing expert. So I apologize if I don't know any of the service program regs and policies. Yes.
Good morning. In my situation, I was fortunate enough that my son got the regular apartment. And then 2 weeks later, he's got the supportive housing apartment from the Housing Authority of Cook County. There are 2 areas of the Housing Authority of Cook County. I am trying to see if my son can get transferred to the supportive housing because he will be more successful. Do you know anyone over there that can help me with that? Because when I've been talking with the 2 different places, they have not given me, the only thing is the supportive housing that I can only hold the apartment for 2 weeks, and then I don't want to have my son to be with nothing. So I just want to know if you know anybody in the Housing Authority that can help me with that, because there are 2 areas of the Housing Authority of Cook County that are not communicating, and I'm getting like nowhere, and I don't want my son to be homeless.
Yeah, I know the CEO, but I don't think that's going to help. Like I said, Housing Authority of Cook County, they operate pretty independently of the state, all the housing authorities. That's a tough one. We don't have any regulatory or authoritative relationship with them at all. So that can be a challenge. I would be really persistent and ask to speak to supervisors and supervisors as far up the chain as you need to go. If they have an appeal process or a grievance procedure, I would follow that. But I would just press for what the information is. I don't know. There's a lot. I could tell you that there's a lot going to go on with that. I mean, I don't know if a new lease was signed at 2 weeks and now a lease needs to be broken in order to go into a new setting, or what all the individual particulars are around that. But there could be a lot. And I would. So you've got one person you're working with from one place and another person you're working with from another place. Yeah, best thing I like to do is email them both at the same time and address them both at the same time.
I did, but they're just, so the supportive housing is waiting from an answer, and they haven't answered, and they haven't answered. So that's why they'll see if there's any other ideas of what I do, because I don't want my son to be in the risk of being homeless.
Yeah, and you guys, like I said already, housing is frustrating. Remember all those handbooks I told you about? A lot of times, not everybody at every housing authority knows everything about all of those handbooks, right? And there's a lot of back and forth and changing around. So people might be researching or even trying to figure out some of that. Back to the personal services worker part too. One thing that's come up a lot that I want to mention real quick is if you're going into some type of affordable or subsidized housing, right? They're going to look at your individual income. All right, the money that you're going to get for the services to pay somebody or do whatever, that's not counted as income. But if you're the PSW and you pay yourself to provide some of those services, now that part of it is your income if you're going to be living in the unit also for families who may need affordable housing resources. Just be aware of that. That service funding, again, it's not part of your income. That will never factor in your housing eligibility, again, unless part of it is what you're taking as your income, and there's no way around that regulatorily, right? Because income is income, and those income limits are pretty tight and standard, right? There's no exceptions to those.
All right, we have time for one more question. It's got to be quick. I had you.
But I will try and get you in touch with somebody at the Housing Authority of Cook County. I will not forget that. That's going to drive me crazy. So I want to get your information before we go.
I'm a parent, so I didn't get too much of what you were saying, maybe about 20% or so. But I want to know on slide 18 where you talk about the CILAs and the maximum 8 residents. Then you had or family-owned home. What's that mean, or family-owned home?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's for the intermittent CILA.
Yeah, what's that mean, family-owned home?
Yeah, so that means, if you have, if you have just an individual living in their family home that they grew up in with their family, they could be eligible for CILA services in the house. So similar services that you would get to a CILA, but in your own home instead of being in another home. Or if, I've seen where people get together and they have 3 or 4 people that they would like to purchase a house and move them in, and then have the intermittent CILA services through a local service provider then come in to provide care for everybody there. That's actually an easier model for a lot of the service providers to do, because that's 3 or 4 people in one place as opposed to just maybe one person in one place. And if they're operating in too many locations versus how many people they have doing the services, that gets to be a bit of a challenge. That answer your question? All right. And I know. If you want more details, again, I'll stick around for a little bit, and I'm happy to answer questions if I have the answers, and I could try to get you somewhere if I don't. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much.
We're going to take a break in just a minute, but I want to mention that there's a lot of different advocacy initiatives going on in the state right now. There's a $4 wage increase for DSPs that there's some stuff on. There's electronic visit verification for home-based waiver. There's a lot of things that happen, and so I encourage you, if you're unaware of those, to do a couple things. Make sure that you follow the ARC of Illinois. If you're not a member, join. It's not expensive. You get a lot of information from them, but you can follow them on Facebook too. They put out a lot of things, either from the ARC or for the Lagos Family Advocacy Group. And there's also another initiative called They Deserve More that you should also connect with. They are always putting out, whether it's on Facebook or via email, about legislation that is pending that we want to let our legislators know that we support or don't. But for the most part, it's things we want to do support. So there are witness slips you can submit, super easy. It looks kind of intimidating at first, but it's not at all. We can walk you through it if you ever have a question. But we need parents to make their voices heard with their legislators. If you have a chance to sit down with your legislator, set up a meeting. I've got 2 new legislators this year in the state of Illinois because of redistricting. So on my agenda this summer is to set up a meeting and go meet them and talk with them. I've been doing a lot of witness slips lately and also sending emails to their offices, and they're responding to me, which, I appreciate. And I know they're listening. We don't always get everything done that we want, but we need to make sure our legislators know us, know our families, know our kids, and know our needs. Because if we don't do it, no one will. So if I can tell you one thing to do at the end of the day today, either join the Arc of Illinois, look up They Deserve More, follow CTC on Facebook. If you're in our database, we try to send things out about witness slips from time to time, but we usually put it on Facebook because it's time sensitive, and I want you to see it right away. So do yourself a favor. If there are things that you don't like and you're not advocating, you're part of the problem. And I hate to say it, but you are. You have to make people know what you need and what you want. That's all you can do. There's a $4 wage increase thing going on right now for DSPs. CILAs are understaffed, day programs understaffed. If we can get that wage increase in, it will help. There's also, I think they're going to start doing an adjustment for DSPs in day programs where they'll be paid sort of commensurate with where they are in the state in terms of like cost of living. They've been doing that in CILAs for a while now. They're going to start doing it in day programs, I heard. So, we're making incremental improvements. It's better. The budget's been better, but it's never enough, as he said. So please do that. If you can do one thing for your kid and every kid in this room, that's what you can do.